This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Dr. Beth Allison Barr is Professor of History and Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, where she specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. Her current best-selling book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, moves the conversation about biblical womanhood beyond Greek grammar and into the realm of church history to show that this belief is not divinely ordained, but a product of human civilization that continues to creep into the church. Barr's historical insights provide context for contemporary teachings about women's roles in the church and help move the conversation forward. Dr. Barr is the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of Christians for Biblical Equality. Barr has written for Christianity Today, The Washington Post, and Religion News Service, and is a regular contributor to The Anxious Bench, the popular Patheos website on Christian history.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back. It's another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. My name is Rob Henderson, and not only am I a vicar on the Vicar's Crossing, I also serve as priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
And I'm Kevin George. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you're wondering, what am I doing? Why did I duck away? I got a lot going on here. But I'm at St. Aidan's Anglican Church, where I hang out with my digital deacon and my pal, Ian.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm a singer-songwriter, producer, content creator, and the person who gets this out to your ears. So hello out there.
Also known to us as the man.
The man, the myth,
Ian the man, the legend. All right. Hey, guys, we got a great guest today. Looking forward to chatting with this wonderful professor and author. Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, and the book is called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And Beth is a writer and dean of the graduate school at Baylor University in Texas, so she'll be joining us here in just a minute.
Baylor plays Longhorns this weekend, guys. So
go Bears! Is it Bears? Yeah,
no,
Baylor Bears.
Baylor Bears. I think it's not.
Is it Bears?
I think it might be
What?
Bears. But
What sport?
football?
That's the football game. Yeah,
College football. They're number 12, I think, in the Big 12, and
always a good basketball team too. Eh?
Yeah,
They
definitely.
play well.
Definitely.
They always play well in the March Madness tournament.
They do. Anyway, all that aside, our land acknowledgement we'd like to do. The Vicar's Crossing acknowledges that our podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenawapak, and Attawandaron peoples, on the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we count as contemporary stewards to this land and with whom we wish to work together towards reconciliation and wholeness between all of our peoples.
Mm-hmm. We are so grateful and thankful to our sponsors here at the Vicar's Crossing, and we want to give a shout out to them, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Many thanks, as always, to Dave Mullen and the whole crew down at A. Miller George today.
Yes, and a shout out to my friend Carol Basada, the pharmacist owner at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, which is locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Get yourself in there today. I know I took a fall out of my office chair last week, Rob. I just, I find new ways to injure myself. And so I pulled a hammy and I seem to have injured my shoulder. And I went in there and boom, she got me some painkillers.
Oh, man.
And all I had to say was Revy Kevy, and I got a 10% discount. And that's true for you too.
That's right.
You know,
And the good news too is that falling out of chair and hamstring were 4-1 odds. So I made $30. So
and if you fall out of a chair and knock over like your coffee, as I know Kevin drinks a lot of,
I do.
there's someone you can call, and you should call Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister, the wonderful human being over there, hooked us up with that. So if you have any spills, any thrills, anything else like that you need Molly Maid to help,
Fish gills.
yeah, they'll do the wonderful cleaning, and they're just very good. So shout out to them as well.
Awesome.
great. Yeah. Thank you so much. Hey, Kevin, we've had some wonderful guests so far on this season of the Vicar's Crossing. The season is not yet over, and we have more coming up. So right now I have to ask you on behalf of Ian, Kevin, who in the world did we book this week?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Rob. Drum roll, please. We booked this guy.
There he is.
What a dude.
Look at that.
Look
Andrew.
at that guy. So if you're listening to this, you're like, what guy? Well, that guy is Bishop Andrew Rumsey, who is the Bishop of Ramsbury in the Diocese of Salisbury in the United Kingdom, and former bandmate in the Crocodiles with our friend Malcolm Geit. Remember Malcolm Geit?
Whoa.
Yes.
Yes. So, yes.
Poet Malcolm Geit. Yeah.
Right. So this guy was in a rock band called the Crocodiles with Malcolm Geit. And so he's now bishop, newly minted, just a couple years. And he has a great new book coming out called English Grounds, A Pastoral Journey. And so he is going to be our first guest on season 6 in the new year. So watch for him.
Whoa.
We're going to have to spend a few minutes in that show getting some road stories and band stories from him.
Definitely.
And about him and Malcolm. So that would be fantastic.
Yep.
All right, guys. Dr. Beth Allison Barr, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. That's the book. And she's our guest. And she is here and going to join us in our Zoom room here on the Vicar's Crossing right now.
Ding dong. Doctor, come in.
And we are so happy today to welcome Dr. Beth Allison Barr to the Vicar's Crossing podcast. Beth, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me.
And could you tell our listeners where you are? Where do you hail from, and where are you coming from today?
I'm in Waco, Texas right now. So at Baylor University, where I'm a professor and an associate dean. And as I told you earlier, I'm a faculty in residence. So I'm actually in my residential apartment on campus.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
No, I was with my wife and I, Catherine Ann and I, we were going down pre-COVID to the Oblate School of Theology down in San Antonio each year to a conference. And the last time we were down there, we rented a car and we took off and we drove up to Dallas, and we went to Waco, and we went to a restaurant called George's.
Oh, yes.
Because that's my last name. And I actually have the t-shirt that says George's Family Restaurant, Waco, Texas. So
yeah, it's a Waco classic.
Is it really?
For a long time. Yeah. You know, what it's known for is called the Big O, which is the beer.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Beer. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what we have to figure out was it brewed by women or brewed by men? More about that in a bit.
Yeah. that I don't know.
I'll tell you what I had there, which I'd never had before, was, and you'll be able to, I won't get it right, but is it called chicken fried steak?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Very Southern.
Yeah.
Very Southern. It's kind of, George's is kind of a glorified, bar food.
Okay.
With a Southern flair. So their chicken fried steak and gravy, classic George's.
It was very good. I felt good because I finally had this thing called chicken fried steak. I was picturing a chicken frying a steak, but that's not at all what it is. So
no, steak fried like chicken is what it is. Pan fried like chicken.
Very, very good. All right. Well, look, let's not delay anymore. As exciting as George's Waco, Texas is, and a big shout out to our friends there, like my royalties from being a George. We wanted to
talk about that.
This book, there we are, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. This book came out in April, and you must be like sold out of them or something because it's a great book.
It's done pretty well, so I think it's been kind of insane how quickly it has spread.
Yeah, well,
So,
it's an incredible book, and I think one of the neat things is that you're very you express a great deal of vulnerability in this book, and as leaders in the church, for me and Rob, like, this is a big deal. Obviously, our contexts are very different in terms of being Anglican or Episcopalian
mhm,
and so on, with the Southern Baptists. But that being said, the issues that women have faced within the church and within the culture are sort of broadly the same. And so we found the book to be
right.
very, very moving. You begin the book with an almost confessional tone, and you write
Mhm.
about the way you viewed biblical womanhood yourself for many years in your life. And I'll just share a few words. You wrote, "This was my understanding of biblical womanhood. God designed women primarily to be submissive wives, virtuous mothers, and joyful homemakers. God designed men to lead in the home as husbands and fathers, as well as in church as pastors, elders, and deacons. I believe that this gender hierarchy was divinely ordained." Elizabeth Elliot famously wrote that femininity receives, women surrender, help, and respond, while husbands provide, protect, and initiate. A biblical woman is a submissive woman.
Mhm.
That all changed for you when your husband, a youth pastor at a church for over 20 years, was
Yeah.
fired from his job. And I wonder if you can share a little with our readers about what happened and describe your feelings of that day you, and I quote here, "walked out the church doors, leaving behind the narrative propagated by my mostly upper middle class white church that all was well and that all would be well because God ordained it so."
Yes, indeed. So I think that day was the moment that I realized how wrong things were in
Mm,
the white evangelical world. And not just at my church, but sort of in general, this treatment of women, this understanding that women, no matter how God has gifted them, no matter what women feel God calling them to do, that they will never be able to in the white evangelical churches, that they will never be able to do the same things as men.
mm,
And that's simply because it's not because of their calling or their skills. It's simply because of their bodies. I mean,
mm,
that's really what it comes down to. That because we inhabit a female body, that there is a ceiling that we will never be able to do the types of leadership that men can do. And it just came to me not only how wrong this is, but how anti-gospel this is,
mm,
and how damaging it is to both women and men when men are taught that there is something about their bodies that makes them capable to lead in a way that women never can.
mm,
And we think about the internalization of that. And if we think about the Church Two movement and all that's going on, and people are, I'm like, well, this is what we've been teaching. We've been teaching men that there is something about them that makes them capable, better to lead, and that there is something about women that makes them underneath. And is it any surprise that we have some men that treat women as less when we teach men that women are less? So that moment in church, as I didn't really know what I was going to do that day, but it just came to a head
mm,
that this world was wrong, that the
mm.
way that the church was wrong, and that I couldn't live in it anymore. And so, I try not to lose my temper all that much. I don't know if I lost my temper that day, or I just couldn't, I just wasn't going to stay in that space any longer. And as I said, I didn't really know what I was going to do. But when I went home, the very first thing I did was I opened my computer and I started writing.
Mm,
And I wrote a blog post called "The Peace of Christmas During the Pain of Life."
mm,
And in it was sort of I guess it was sort of a little bit of my manifesto, that what I thought what was wrong with the church wasn't about Jesus, it was about people.
mm,
And so it was sort of, my faith hadn't been damaged by this, but my faith in the church
mhm.
had been,
Yeah.
and that the church needed to be, we needed to change the church.
Mhm.
And so, as I said, I still didn't really know what I was going to do, but it was a beginning for me. because I realized I couldn't not speak about this any longer. And so that sort of began my path forward. It was also a path of healing for me as well, as my husband and my family moved out of that church and began to try to, pick up our lives and move forward again. And so anyway, so it was a time of healing for us, and also a time that I began to speak out, mostly on my blog in the beginning.
I have to say that one of the things about it, and this was all over the fact that your husband was advocating for a woman to teach Sunday school. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I mean, with all these things, there's lots of different pieces wrapped up to it. And so part of it was also the challenging church leadership, which often these authoritarian structures often go with these patriarchal sort of structures. So it was the challenging of church leadership over trying to get a woman to co-teach Sunday school. It wasn't even
just co-teach.
it was co-teach. It was
Oh my
co-teach.
goodness.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that struck me about the scene that you paint is because that moment when you leave the church, they're having this sort of a reception for you and your husband because of the ending of the job. And the part that struck me was the picture you paint, because I often say that the enemy of faith or of the church is not all the big boogeymen that people paint it to be. It's respectability. And to me, the picture that you painted is just so rife with that. I just wonder if you could share a little taste of what they were doing for you.
Yeah, no, it was essentially what they had done is they had set up a sort of a farewell, I guess, sort of table in the foyer in which people were supposed to write notes to us. And they had put it like, in the center of the foyer, like in this prominent sort of space. And I actually had told them, I said, we had actually said, we don't want you to do anything, because this is not a goodwill sort of thing. But at the same time, the church, they had to do something because they weren't telling people why we were really leaving. I mean, that was the whole part of it. And so they had to make it look okay. They had to make it, try to dress it up and look okay. And so that was what I think the hypocrisy of it really just struck me. This attempt that they're trying to sugarcoat, make it all look right, that this is what we are doing. When the reality is that, we were being fired because we had challenged church leadership over the position of women. And nobody was telling that. So I think it was the hypocrisy of that too. That really just struck me at that moment.
Well, I just thought it was a great image of you just deciding in the middle of everyone feting you.
I did.
You know what?
See ya.
See you later.
I'm out.
I was out of there. And it's kind of, it's one of those. So I'm not sure if I'm proud of that moment.
I am. I'm proud of you for it.
It's
a very JetBlue moment. I don't know if you remember the JetBlue guy who hit decided he'd had enough. And he made an announcement he'd had enough, and then he hit the escape hatch, slid down the thing, and went home and said, "I'm done." Anyway,
that's what I did.
I was wondering if you had a microphone with you, if you would just hold it out and say,
I'm done.
Just drop it and I don't know if anyone would have got it at the time. I think
probably not. Well, look, we really enjoyed the book overall, and a couple of parts of it that I wanted to talk to you about, because I really got a lot out of. I really found your chapter on Paul extremely helpful. As a pastor, I've led Bible studies on Paul, and I've sat in Bible studies on Paul, and so Paul. This was really helpful. Good old Paul. I was thinking this should be a required reading, this chapter, in every Bible study on Paul from now on. So just read Beth's chapter on this before you get into it. But as I was reading it, I was recalling a story of, I had a conversation with someone that's close to me, and this was years ago. And she was working as a director for youth ministry in a leadership position. And she was struggling because the context that she was in that church very much is what you're talking about in your book, with the understanding of women and women's place and such. And she was struggling with this passage from 1 Corinthians that gets a lot of play from Paul, right? Which is As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches,
Yeah.
for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. So apparently, says Paul. But the struggle that what she was talking to me about was this, she's hearing this read and preached on, but at the same time, she's in this leadership position. She's being entrusted with the care and spiritual direction of these young people. And at the same time, she's feeling that she's not, faithfully living her life faithful to the Bible in these types of passages. And in your book, you pose an excellent question, which is this, and I'd like to read it for our listeners. You write, what if evangelicals have been understanding Paul through the lens of modern culture instead of through the way Paul intended to be understood? Christians in the past may have used Paul to exclude women from leadership, but this doesn't mean that the subjugation of women is biblical. It just means that Christians today are repeating the same mistake of Christians in the past, modeling our treatment of women after the world around us instead of the world that Jesus shows us is possible. I wish I had that when I was having that conversation with her, but could you share with us a little bit more about, seeing Paul through this lens of our culture and how that really can reframe our understanding of why the church views the women's roles are the way they are?
Oh yes, Paul is so much at the center of this whole conversation. And when I first decided to write this book, I didn't actually want to write on Paul. I wanted to skip the biblical argument because I felt like we had just become, that it was just a stalemate. It was a stalemate. It was of an argument over grammar. And it was my husband who convinced me. He was like, if you don't get them at Paul, he said, they're not going to follow your argument. He was like, you've got to show them how history matters, even in the reading of Paul. And he was right. I was a little, resistant at first, but I did ultimately decide. And so the way that I wrote that chapter was essentially from the way I teach in class, when we look at Paul. And what I have learned to do is that, one of the problems with how we approach Paul is that we approach Paul. I mean, if we think about all of the letters that he is either authored or associated with in the New Testament, and if we look at those letters from, we think about women in them, we often start with passages like 1 Corinthians 14. We start with Ephesians 5. We start with, these passages that seem to emphasize the subordination of women. But if we step back and look at those passages, what we realize is that those are very small parts of what Paul is doing. I mean, Paul's writing, he's a pastor at heart. He is writing pastoral letters, dealing with problems in all of these churches. We know that these churches, varied in the problems that they were having. We know that Paul gives them specific advice that has to do with their specific situations. I mean, so many scholars have talked about this, and pastors have talked about this. We know this is what Paul is trying to do. And so it's really funny to me that when we think about women, we don't look at those passages within the context of what Paul is doing within these particular churches. For some reason, the rules fall apart when we look at these passages and we're like, oh no, Paul's clearly talking to all women for all times, that they are supposed to be submissive to men, etc. And so, if we actually looked at those passages through the lens of what Paul is doing throughout the rest of his letters, if we look at those passages through the lens of, say, for example, Romans 16, what we find is that there's no way Paul is telling all women to ask their husbands at home and to not speak in church, because we have Junia. And we have Phoebe, who was given Romans and was probably the first preacher of Romans. So how could Paul be telling women they have to be silent for all time if he is giving women the authority to preach and teach? So, it's kind of flipping that perspective. And then if we add to that the historical context, which we so like to ignore.
Right.
Around these passages. Exactly. I mean, it's just crazy to me. We so like to ignore around these passages. And the passage in 1 Corinthians 14 that actually, I've written more about this on one of my blogs, where I told the story of how I first realized that this was a Roman quotation, that, this passage that says, why ask your husbands at home? Women should not speak. They should ask their husbands at home. This is actually almost verbatim a
Mhm.
phrase that we find in Roman law.
Wow.
And we also find it in Roman literature. And it's
Mhm.
like a pretty
Mhm.
common phrase. And so it, I was actually having a conversation with a New Testament professor once, and I was commenting on, we had been talking about Cato's speech, which is, I quote in the book, which is
Mhm.
actually from the 3rd century BC, but written down after the 1st century. And it's a speech, it has to do with this moment in Roman history, where the women are upset because a law that was put upon them while they were at war has not been lifted from them. And so
Mhm.
they're all going to the Senate, to try to get them to repeal this law. And one of the statesmen, Cato, is there, and he's in the streets, and he's just appalled that women are running around trying to get involved in politics. And so he has this whole sort of tirade that he gives against them, in which he says, what are you doing out in the streets? You should be at home, only asking your husbands. And then he kind of ends this letter. I really like the way that he ends his speech. He says, if we give women, essentially, if we give them an inch, they're going to take over,
Oh, yeah.
and
That's
rule
right.
everything.
Oh, no.
And so it's, really
Yeah.
funny. And I was talking with this professor, and I said, that speech just reminds me so much of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
And the professor was like, well, have you ever thought about why? And, it was that moment I was like, is that a quotation? Is that a Roman quotation? And the professor was like, yeah, just
Yeah,
go
there
look
you
at
go.
it,
Yeah.
in the context. I mean, these are, and Paul, this is not the only time Paul does this. I mean, this is a pretty common rhetorical device that Paul uses,
Mhm.
which is a pretty common Roman rhetorical device,
Right.
where you quote what you are teaching against.
Mhm.
And, and Jesus does this too. Jesus says,
Mhm.
you have heard, but let me tell
Let me
you
tell
this.
you.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is
Exactly.
essentially what Paul is doing. He says,
Yeah.
you have
Mhm.
heard, but let me tell you this.
Yeah.
So anyway,
No,
um, yeah, it's just, if you look at Paul from the perspective of Paul,
yeah,
he's not telling women to be silent.
exactly.
And then
Yeah.
when you put him within a historical perspective, it just becomes so much more clear.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
Which is why,
if
yeah,
that's a little
so
bit helpful.
no, it is very much, and it's just reminds me, as I say often, it's important to do the work around these scriptures instead of
Yes.
just us all sitting down and reading them together, and to do some work behind it, and it because it gives you a reframing and a new vision of things that's very helpful.
Yes,
Big
that's
time.
exactly
So
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned Phoebe, Junia. There many
Mhm.
women in Scripture, and in the life of the church, certainly, that you referenced through your book as well. And I was going to ask you about one that I started to read a bit more about after I
Yeah.
read your book. And we're getting ready to celebrate All Saints Day coming up on November 1st. We take time to kind of consider the great cloud of witness that we
Yes.
stand with as Christians. And you write about a woman who I think we really should be mindful of, Marjorie Kemp.
Yeah.
And I think she does have a commemoration day in the Episcopal Church in November. And Kevin, you can correct me. I don't know if there's one on our calendar here.
I don't know if she's on or not,
Canada,
to be
but
honest.
yeah,
What
but
we're
anyway.
just a
Probably
couple.
not.
But
Okay, everybody listening, bad vicars.
Yeah,
Bad Vickers. We
bad
don't know
Vickers.
her day. Yeah.
But certainly know her name. And
I'll
of
look
her.
it up while you ask the question. Okay,
Please
Rob?
That's
do.
what you should do.
Please
Yep.
do. Yeah. But anyway, for those not familiar with Marjorie, they're listening today. She lived in the late 14th, early 15th century, and is identified as a Christian mystic and a pilgrim. But she may also have been known to people in her day as somewhat combative. In some respects, she was a woman who was not afraid of a male-dominated church, and she had something to say to the men of the day about theological issues. And that really stands out because we know what a patriarchal system the church was in medieval times. And in fact, as you point out, Marjorie was arrested after a clash with the Bishop of York at one point. And you point out that Marjorie, she did have money, which may have afforded her some status that perhaps other women of her day may not have had, but you also point out that she was helped by the fact that she didn't stand alone. A great cloud of female witness, not only remembered, but revered by the medieval Christian world, stood with her. Can you share a little bit more about Marjorie and why you wanted to hold her story up and her witness up in your book?
Yes, no, that's great. No, Marjorie Kemp is one of my favorite women to teach on. She's also probably, as much as I like to teach on her and read about her, I don't think I would have liked to have been her friend in real life.
Mm.
She seems to me that, yeah, she always was making disturbances wherever she went. And she definitely, Marjorie was one of those, she knew what she was called to do.
Yeah.
And she was also very vulnerable. Whenever she made mistakes, she was very clear about it, about what the mistakes were. But she also wasn't afraid to stand up for what she thought God was calling her to do. And that's one of the reasons why I used her, is because we have these moments. And I describe one moment. It's not the only moment in the book of Marjorie Kemp where she stands up against male clerics and she says, I've been called by God, essentially. And I'm going to keep doing what God has called me to do. And so I think that's something that can give us a lot of, I think that should give us some courage to think about a woman in the 15th century, whose life was much more precarious. And yet she still has the strength, she believed what God had called her to do. And one of the things that I think gave her strength is that the medieval church did a much better job of remembering women.
Mm.
And I mean, you think about modern evangelical sermons, and especially in in low church Protestant, very low church Protestant like Baptist, which I'm a tradition of, Bible church, Church of Christ, all of these sort of things. I mean, if you go through and listen to the sermons preached in these churches, they are mostly sermons that include stories about men, and
Mhm.
that include stories about men in the Bible. Women are often just the supporting folk. They're not, they're simply not preached in the same way, that they were in the medieval world. I mean, this is something that is different. This is a definite difference between the medieval and the early modern world. And so we find that women are not only a part of the liturgy and the stories that are preached, but they were also all over the art of these churches. And these are strong women.
Mhm.
These are
Mhm.
women who were powerful preachers and teachers. And we do know, historians have traced how these women actually from the early medieval world to the late medieval world, they actually become more domesticated over time. Like in the early medieval world, they are really sort of in your face, no apology preachers, evangelists, slaying dragons, doing whatever. And then as they move to the later medieval period, they actually become a little bit more domesticated. They start, they're not quite as assertive. They often defer to male authority a little bit more. But even within that, they were still a very prominent part of the faith of women like Marjorie Kemp. And so we know, just reading through her book, Marjorie tells us that she draws on these women. I mean, this isn't just me saying it. If you read through her book, she tells us that she draws on these women. Saint Bridget was one of the women that gave her courage that married women too could be called by God. And then, of course, Mary Magdalene and Saint Catherine, and Margaret herself, who we know that Marjorie is probably named after. All of these women play roles, and one of the women that Marjorie goes to get, she has all these interaction with male clergy, but buried in her book is this really amazing encounter between her and Julian of Norwich, who is a famous anchoress. And Marjorie goes to Julian and she says, all these people are telling me that what I am doing is not of God. And Julian essentially tells her to stand strong, that God has given her this gift and she should keep going. And so we clearly see Marjorie in her, telling us about how these women in Christian history, as well as even, Julian of Norwich, that they encourage and inspire her, and stand with her. She knows that women are a part of what God is doing in this world, and that gives her courage. So, Protestant women today, I don't know if we have that cloud. We've kind of forgotten that cloud of witnesses. In the Baptist tradition, we have a few women. We have like Lottie Moon,
Right.
who often is told to us at certain times of the year, offering missionary offerings. So there's a few women like that, but not to the same scale as what we see in the medieval world.
Right.
And I think that has an impact on us, because we've simply forgotten how God has used these women in the past.
Exactly.
And so it
Yeah.
makes us we're less sure that God can use us today,
Right.
because we've forgotten that history.
Well,
No,
go ahead, Rob.
right. I was just gonna say I'm thankful for that, and it just personally gives me pause to relook at how I'm framing that cloud of witness in
Yeah.
our Saints Day sermon, right?
Hmm.
And not that there's not women mentioned, but how it's being framed, and that's important.
Yes, it is. It's very important.
And I think that these two vicars we are either abundantly ignorant, which is possible,
Okay.
However, I have to say, in my brief moment of research while you asked Beth the question, all I could discover was that Marjorie is kept in the Episcopal calendar, the Church of England's calendar, but I could not see it in the November calendar for the Anglican Church of Canada.
Nope.
So
Nope.
Archbishop Linda Nichols, if you're listening, the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada, Archbishop Nichols, why are we not keeping Marjorie Kemp?
We're making a phone call today.
Call out.
Yeah, she is somewhat of a local saint. I mean, this is one of the things that I did find in the medieval world. We often have, we have the liturgies that included all of the saints
Yes.
of the Catholic world, but then they also had their local saints, the ones that were more important to the
Right.
particular, like Saint Winifred,
Oh, yeah.
who was mostly, at the time in the western part of England and in Wales, was a very important figure, but we don't find her in East Anglia,
Right.
etc. as much. And so maybe Marjorie Kemp is a
Maybe.
look saint.
Although we keep Hildegard and we keep Julian.
That's true.
We keep Julian, So anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
Let's get on to the Reformation, because we all know we want to talk about the Reformation. So you're right.
Yes.
You write about the Reformation and about the irony of Reformation theology for women. You affirm that Luther was right about faith, Jesus, the priesthood of all believers in the Bible, but you're quick to add, at the same time, the Reformation wasn't perfect, and glorifying the past because we like that story better isn't history, you write. It's propaganda. Just because I agree with the outcome of the Reformation theologically doesn't mean I think everything that happened during the Reformation era was good. I found this chapter to be particularly insightful, and I love the story. Actually, there's some good humor in here too, from an early mentor of yours who was given a pair of men's pants. She was training to be a missionary, and she was told to hang them on her bed and pray for God to fill them. That was so funny.
I saw her last the Christmas before this came out. We actually went and stayed with her. She's now back in the US, and so we went and stayed with her, and I told that story, and she started laughing. She was like, God never filled them. She's still single.
I told this to a friend on the phone today, and he laughed and laughed. I said, you got to hear this line from this book. It's incredible. Anyway, listen, you're right. Reformation theology might have removed the priest, but it replaced him with the husband. In 1563, Tudor homilies, God bless us, the Anglicans, a series of sermons authorized by the Anglican Church clearly show this when they write, quote, "Let women be subject to their husbands as the Lord, for the husband is the head of the woman, as Christ is the head of the church. Here you understand that God has commanded that you should acknowledge the authority of the husband and refer to him the honor of obedience." The sermon continues, emphasizing that wives should cover their heads as a sign of submission. And in an eerie echo of the ancient Roman paterfamilias, the orderly household once again became the barometer for both state and the church. And the waning power of the Catholic priest was balanced by the waxing power of the Protestant husband. So post-Reformation options for women changed dramatically, right? Examples you use of like women's alternatives to marriage, and you mentioned Katie Luther, right? So you mentioned
Yeah.
her and what happened with her. Can you share more about her and about what happened with medieval women and how the professional job of early modern men changed all that?
Yes, and so this is part of, with the Reformation, the Reformation chapter and the Paul chapter were the two hardest ones for me to write.
Mhm.
And part of it is because I knew I was walking into a quagmire of arguments,
Yes.
about both of them. First with Pauline scholars, and then, which is, why, if you read my Paul chapter, one of the ways I got around that quagmire was, instead of asserting this is definitely what I think happened,
Mhm.
I asked questions.
Yes.
It's like, what,
Nicely
the
done.
things that were more likely. It's part of it. The Reformation chapter, I got some good eyes on it before I sent it out. I sent it out because I know a lot of scholars, obviously. So I got some good eyes on it. But one of the things I really was trying to get across was that this isn't just about Reformation theology. What happened with the Reformation era is that there were other changes going on in the early modern world that then sort of connected to the Reformation theology. And one of those, a big change was the changing economic and social landscape of Europe, in which we see this, jobs beginning to move, not quite outside of the home, but beginning to be sort of professionalized in a way that they hadn't been before. Brewing is the example that I give.
You got my attention with beer. When you said beer, I was like, hold on a second. My mind is blown. So tell us about the alewives.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is the thing in the medieval world, the people who made beer were women and monks. They were the ones who made beer and sold it. And because this was part of an extension of what a woman was already doing in the household, it was something that she was brewing for her family. And so she would just brew a little bit more and get, enough, and then sell it to her neighbors. I mean, this is before there were preservatives in beer. And so it wouldn't last for all that long. So it had to be brewed very regularly. And so this is what women did. And a lot of them became really good at it, and in fact begin to supply it, because you could think about this. It's like, yes, I could spend a lot of time making beer for my family, or I can buy it from the woman down the street who does a really good job with it. Spare me that time doing it. And she's always has a supply. So I'm just going to do that. And so these women who became known as alewives, and this is what they did, is they brewed beer to sell, and it brought in income for their families. Some of these women were single. And so, I first became aware of some of these women when I was looking through some records, a long time ago, when I was looking through some parish records, and it was the tax records, the poll tax records, actually, in Shrewsbury. And so we see some of these women who are listed. They're not listed with any husband, and they seem to have made quite a bit of money in brewing. And so we know that, this, certainly women were not the only ones who were brewing, but they were some of the primary ones who were making money from this. As I said, also monasteries. There is a connection between monasteries, monastics, and beer. Yes. But anyway, as we move into the early modern era, what happens is that these types of trades begin to be professionalized. And as they become professionalized, they begin to be taken over by men. And we see these guilds starting to form that had standards for how beer is to be produced. They were written by committees of men who would get together,
have a committee,
and then would take it over. And we see women getting pushed out of these business. They simply could not compete. They did not have the capital. They did not have the deep economic pockets, and they just simply couldn't keep up. And so what we see, this is all across the Reformation era. So what we find is that women's ability to compete with men in these areas is declining, at the same time that we have this introduction of Reformation theology, which puts a great deal of emphasis on the role of wife at the same time that we have what, scholars call a hardening of
Mhm.
laws about women, where
Mhm.
we see legal codes becoming more clearly enforced, that begin to regulate household structure.
Mhm.
And women are, the laws about being a wife, that women are under the authority of men when they get married, that
Mhm.
it becomes much more difficult to live as a single woman. All of
Mhm.
these laws, this change is happening at the same time. And so what we end up with is this Reformation theology that emphasizes the role of wife at the same time that the legal
Mhm.
framework
Yep.
is saying that the role of women is to be under the authority of men, is to be married and under this male authority. And so to be a Christian woman then becomes to be a woman under the authority of her husband. And so it's not just Reformation theology.
No.
It's this confluence of factors, that leads to sort of this hardening, or actually not hardening, but the lessening of options for women.
Right.
And their role, their identity becomes, really conflated with this role of wife.
What was the line from Luther about the snail? Remind
Oh
me.
yeah, that's actually really funny. So, the sermon, I actually quoted that from two places, and the first one was, I'm trying to remember whose sermon it was, an early modern sermon, and that's where I first ran across it, where it said, that a wife is to be like a snail, always carrying her home with her because that's her place.
Mm.
And then one of my students who was reading a draft of this, she said, Luther says that too. And she like pulled up the sermon for me and she was like, you need to quote Luther also because people are more familiar with Luther.
Yeah.
And so that's how I quoted Luther. So this was actually a common phrase, a
Mm.
common way of thinking, that a woman, is like a snail because the home is the identity of a woman.
On her back.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
A commonly held myth is that medieval folks had no access to the Bible. You
Yeah.
refute this in the book and write about gender inclusivity and both now
Yeah.
and in more ancient times. I'm just going to quote you really quickly. You write, medieval, holy,
Easy for you to say, Ian.
yeah,
Say that twice.
wow. It's like I got a new tongue. Medieval people knew scripture at least as well, if not better, than we do today. Franz van Leer, is that correct?
Franz van Leer.
Sweet.
Yeah, he's
Okay,
a
Franz van
professor at
Leer
Calvin.
reminds us that biblical knowledge was not confined to the clergy. The Bible revolution wrought by the Reformation among ordinary Christians began with ordinary Christians in the medieval world. The medieval, and you go on to say the medieval church. I'm struggling with that word so much. You write, the medieval church had a long tradition of lay access to biblical texts.
Yeah.
You point out the scripture flows through medieval sermons, with the Latin text translated so that ordinary what is wrong? Ordinary Christians, wow, would understand the word of God. Notable for our purposes is the fact that this biblical text often included gender inclusive language. Finally got to the end of that sentence. Can you tell us more about gender inclusivity in the Bible and indeed these 15th century sermons that you studied?
Now, wait a minute. Before you do, I want to know what was going on in this class you just left. He was in a class in college.
It wasn't a medieval class.
It was a medieval. I can tell you that. It might have been evil, but it wasn't medieval.
Medieval.
Do you actually want to know what we were talking about?
No, it's good.
Okay.
Let's get to Beth's answer.
because everyone listening to this podcast might fall asleep.
Okay.
Oh,
Sorry,
goodness.
Beth. Go ahead.
No, y'all are great. So, chapter 5 was the first chapter that I wrote of the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was it's actually the chapter that first really got me interested in these differences between sort of modern evangelicals, what they think about the Bible, and the reality of what we see going on in the medieval world. I've actually just written an article. I think it's coming out next year, that talks about the myth essentially of the medieval Bible, that the medieval Bible is much more commonplace than modern Protestants really even know. And so one of the places where scripture appears all the time, of course, is in sermons.
Mhm.
And, we think about, it's sort of funny. We have Bibles everywhere today,
Mhm.
and they even had Bibles everywhere in the early modern period. But where most people get their scripture from is not from reading the Bible on their own, even though we're Protestants. They get it from listening,
Mhm.
from hearing in sermons. And this
Yeah.
was the same way in the medieval world. Um, and so one of the things that struck me very early on, in fact, I wrote one of my very first conference papers way back in, like, I don't know, 2006, 2007, maybe earlier than that. One of my very first conference papers was on gender inclusive language in the medieval Bible. And and in fact, my opening for that paper was the controversy over the TNIV.
Right.
Everybody gets all upset about the TNIV, today's New International Version, which made a big deal, said, hey, we're making this language more gender inclusive, and everybody freaked out about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I simply wrote how funny it was that medieval people did this all the time and nobody got freaked out about it.
Right.
Right.
It was just pretty habitual in medieval sermons. And so what we find is that medieval priests regularly took the androcentric language, the translation of the Bible, where they would quote the Latin, and then they would translate it. And when they would translate it for their congregation, they would, instead of, if the word was we're, instead of using man, they would say man and women, men and women, and or he or she. That's often what they would do, is they would use he or she, men and women, etc. And this is pretty common, where they insert this into their translation of the text. And it seems really clear that the reason they're doing this is so that the women in their congregation will hear those words as applying to them. Which is extremely pastoral,
Yes.
and it is exactly what seems like we should be doing. And
Mhm.
so it just really struck me how the medieval world didn't really have a problem with this, but yet as modern evangelicals or the modern church, we had a
Yeah.
significant problem with
All
this.
wound up. Yeah.
And so the question, of course, was why? What's happened here? Is it really about the authority of biblical text?
Mm.
Because I can tell you that medieval people had a pretty high view of scripture,
Yes.
if you
Indeed.
want
Yes,
to
indeed.
use it that way.
Yeah.
And so is it really about a high view of scripture, or is it about something else? Is there another motive that is going on?
Mhm.
And so the example that I used in my chapter, and that's gotten me in quite a bit of trouble since the book came out,
Oh,
was
do
over the
tell.
ESV. Oh, the ESV. Oh gosh. My prediction was, and you might like this, there was some people who early on kind of had, they wanted to do a drinking game on the, I figured you would like it,
Oh, you
a
know us well
drinking
now.
game
Yeah.
on the criticism of the making of biblical womanhood, and sort of the
Okay.
vote. It was like, okay, which chapter? The prediction was that it was going to be either the Paul chapter or the Reformation. Was it the Paul chapter, or inerrancy? That's what it was, or
Okay.
inerrancy that I go after, in chapter 7.
Yes.
But really, the chapter that I think has come out as being the most criticized is chapter 5,
Wow.
where I go after the ESV.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's been pretty interesting. And inerrancy is pretty close.
Good.
It's right under there, under the ESV, but that kind of makes sense, with Paul being the lowest one
Okay.
that got,
Interesting.
a lot of pushback.
Wow.
Yeah, which
Okay.
is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But people got really upset that when they learned that the ESV was not just motivated by trying to create the best translation of the
Translation.
Bible,
That's right.
that their goal was to create, was to emphasize God's vision for complementarity
Yes.
between, I mean, that's one of their stated objectives, to do this. And so how do they do that? They emphasize androcentric language, emphasizing men, which makes it look like the Bible, especially in some of these passages, for men especially for male leadership. And so they take places where the word, it could mean brothers or sisters, and they make it only brothers, completely leave sisters out of it. All of the passages that emphasize leadership, they favor male nouns and pronouns to make it look like that it's only talking about male leadership. And then they do things like, with Phoebe, instead of Phoebe being translated as a deacon, which that's the way the word is translated in most other places, she's translated as a servant. There is no other reason for her being translated as a servant other than they're making a point about her.
Yeah.
And then I think you point out the insertion of wives too, right? Like instead of just saying women.
Yeah, no, this is actually interesting, with this is something from the KJV, from the King James Version, that we find with the translation, the early modern English translation of the Bible, is that women throughout the Old Testament especially don't really fit neatly into early modern English categories of either a single woman or a wife, because they had a lot of different sexual standards for women and roles that women played in the Old Testament. And so what we see with the KJV, with these English Bibles, these early modern English Bibles, is almost all women became either wives or they became concubines and prostitutes. They had very few ways to understand what these women are. And so they got, we have these raped women who became wives. Think about even Hagar, those words that we use to describe them are not really the way they would have been described in the Old Testament world. Right. So Naomi Tadmore does a great job with this if you want to look at her work.
Amen.
Yeah, definitely. So just one final question to kind of wrap up our podcast today. Beth, we had Kate Bowler on our podcast recently.
Yeah.
Human again.
She sent us
stickers. She's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So if you've got an hour, we certainly highly recommend that podcast.
Yes.
She's amazing. But in writing in the chapter Sanctifying Subordination, you share a story about hearing Kate speak from, of all places, Pat Robertson's pulpit. Her topic for that speech was how conservative evangelical women have carved out religious authority and traditions that prohibit women's leadership. And in her talk, she described her kind of spreadsheet of Twitter profiles for evangelical women. Words like coffee and yoga pants and hot mess were favorites. But wife and mother were common identities expressed too. And this got you thinking about what Twitter profiles for the medieval women you study might look like. So you write this in that chapter. They would be rather different from Bowler's evangelical women. I think Marjorie Kemp, Marjorie's showing up again, would definitely include the word creature. Maybe creature of God, professional crier, pilgrim, secondary, virgin, vowess. I doubt Kemp would include any reference to her family or her husband. Julian of Norwich would be easier to guess. Enclosed nun, servant of God, visionary, spiritual advisor, lives alone.
Yeah, very alone.
I like that one. Yeah. Probably, though, Margaret of Antioch would be my favorite. Defiant virgin, impervious to torture, dragon slayer. That's great. Evangelist, miracle worker, and friend of God. Neither marriage nor motherhood would figure significantly in the Twitter profiles of these medieval women. They wouldn't bother highlighting domestic skills either. But what evangelicals have failed to realize is that, according to Randall Ballmer, another past guest, the traditional concept, the traditional concept of femininity that we believe to be from the Bible is nothing more than a 19th century construct. Can you say a little bit more about this submissive construct and how it's not in keeping with the strong witness of people like you mentioned, Julian and Margaret and Marjorie?
Yeah, so I have to say something about Kate Bowler too first. She's it's interesting how your lives converge. And so I met Kate when did I first meet her? It was at a American Historical Association meeting where she was speaking on her first book, Blessed. And
Okay.
I heard her talking about that, and I was like, oh, I'm a president of a conference. Kate, would you come and be one of our plenaries? And she was like, oh yeah. And so that was what she was coming for. And Kristen Dumais was also, Kristen was also at this conference. And it was the conference, it was actually at Virginia Beach is where the conference was. And it was at Pat Robertson's, actually, as I said, it was at Regent University there on Virginia Beach. And while the conference was going on, a Trump rally took over the conference. Yes. And we got kicked out of all of the buildings we were supposed to be in.
I need this building.
That's how we ended up in the chapel. It's because we got kicked out. And so we got put in there, and I was like, is this it was this really crazy moment, that we end up. So I actually have a picture. I've never put it out there, but I have a picture of Kate standing behind Pat Robertson's, pulpit with her arms up in the air like the white Jesus behind her. It's really great. It was really
good. That will be Kate.
Good.
Yeah, she was
good Canadian.
She was fantastic.
Good Canadian.
This was 2016. Yeah, this was that year. It was so weird because this conference happened right before everything exploded. But anyway, so I still remember her giving that talk, and it was what became The Preacher's Wife. And so one of her, academic books, her last academic book that came out. And so it just really struck me. In fact, I remember writing in my notes as she's talking about these Twitter profiles of women, and I was just, thinking how different they were from the medieval women that I knew. I mean, I just thought it was really funny the way that women identify themselves in order to give themselves authority. Right. And so in the modern world, for women religious to give ourselves authority, or women of faith to give ourselves authority, we have to emphasize the fact that we're wives and mothers, or at least have some sort. There has to be something. We have to put our family in there to some degree. And it just really struck me how in the medieval world, that was not what gave women religious authority. What gave women religious authority was being distanced from their roles as wives and mothers. And so, again, this just shows this shift in understanding about what it means to be a woman religious. And that shift has really nothing to do with the Bible. It has to do with the culture in which we lived. Right. So that was, Kate's, it was a really, of course, I had no idea I was going to write this chapter at that time when I was making those notes. But I'm very grateful to Kate for that. But I think, this emphasis on Twitter profiles, it just really shows how the role of women and what we expect of women has become much more domesticated. Right. And, that women today, what we are known for in the spirit, in the religious world, are women who are married with children and are meek and mild, and that we are deferential to the authority of our husbands, and we are deferential to male leadership. And so you can think about that, even, I still remember like Russell Moore's article that he wrote in 2006, where he said that Beth Moore was essentially the gateway drug to women preaching, because she put up this model of women having this type of spiritual authority that they should not have. Right. And I think he since has backed off on what he said in that article. But nonetheless, it still really shows how much our understanding of what women should do has changed. And that understanding is influenced by the culture around us, not by the Bible at all.
Right. So I just wanted to ask one last, it's two-parter really, and it's about near the end of the book. Rob was jumping in saying he was getting the last question, but he's not getting the last question. No, that was my bad. But and the first part is really personal in the sense that you really are vulnerable again coming into the end of this book. When you speak to the fact that you had told, I believe what you refer to as your second darkest secret, when you talk about your husband's, being fired about advancing for women. Now I'm learning co-teaching. Right. And but you also say that giving that glimpse of pain and trauma that the experience caused your family. You've told how it's pushed you to stop being silent and to speak the historical truth about complementarianism. But I haven't told you my darkest story. It's your own Me Too story, if you will, or Church Too story. And you share that along with your husband's firing as a way of thinking about complementarianism today and how that's had an effect on you personally. I wonder if you want to share a little bit about that before I wrap up.
Yeah, deciding to tell that story was not an easy decision.
I bet not.
And one of the reasons why I decided ultimately to include it was because I wanted people to realize that ideas really do matter. And we're living in this moment where, clearly there is a problem among conservative churches even, I mean, really just, I don't know. It's broader than that altogether, but, especially we see it very much in conservative churches, but where there is a correlation. And in fact, I was just reading an article the other day that talked about, this very clear research correlation between women who are in conservative churches that teach male headship and their propensity to stay within abusive marriages. And it's just, it seems to me that there is such a clear line between teaching that women belong under male authority and that, that women by our very design are designed to be under male authority, and a connection between that teaching and abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and it seems to me that we cannot deny that connection. And so for me, telling the story about how I was involved in what some considered to be fringe movements at the time, this Bill Gothard, which people thought was fringe, but he really was much more central. These teachings that he emphasized, which were very clear, like James Dobson's. I mean, they clearly influenced James Dobson in the sense of sort of this umbrella where the proper household has the man over the woman over the children. And that's the way that the household should function. And when you step outside of that household, it's taught when you step outside of that structure, it's dangerous. And it's dangerous to essentially to the spiritual health of your family. The problem is that households that, Christian churches that emphasize that household structure also have this direct correlation with sexual abuse and domestic abuse of women. And so what I wanted people to see with me telling that story in there, I wanted them to understand that this isn't just about this beautiful complementarity vision. I mean, that's the way John Piper tries to sell it to us. It's this beautiful vision of how the world should work. And, it's like, well, that sounds really nice and all, but if we look at the evidence that we see is that there is not beauty here. The evidence is that it teaches men that they are better than women. And then they treat women as less. And that correlation is very, very clear. And it's not just clear in the modern church, it's clear too. I mean, we can follow this train back through, history. And patriarchy teaches that women are under the authority of men and that men are better than women. And it is never good for women. So that was my point in telling that story.
I'm thankful for you having shared it. And I count you among two others that you name in that chapter as a cloud of witnesses because you did that. Because I think for a lot of women, it matters. I just wonder if you can finish with just a little bit about Dorothy Sayers and her friend C.S. Lewis, and a lesser known woman, which is Christine de Pizan. These women are indeed among the cloud of witnesses as we prepare, as Rob said earlier, All Saints, All Souls coming up next week. Because the point you make, I think, as you wrap this book is that you don't stand alone, right?
Right.
Like, we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, and you telling your story is a part of that. And so we're most grateful for that. But these women as well and what they did, maybe a little bit about Sayers and Christine Pizan.
Yeah, let me start with Christine de Pizan because I suspect people don't know her quite as well. And Christine de Pizan is another woman who lived across the same time period as Marjorie Kemp. And Christine de Pizan is, she is important for many reasons, one of which is because she's one of the first women that we know of in the Western world who earns her living by writing. I mean, she's
Mm.
actually the first sort of freelance journalist, first professional writer. And she starts having to do this at a very young age when her husband dies, leaving her alone with 3 children and that she has to raise. And so the way that she does this is she starts writing poems and biographies and all sorts, and everybody really likes her writing, and she's connected to the French court, and so she's able to earn a living and support her family through doing this. But she also is known for getting involved with this pretty hot topic debate. I mean, I think about if Twitter had been around then. I mean, this would have been all over Twitter, and it was over a book called The Romance of the Rose, which was kind of like 50 Shades of Grey. In the medieval world, it was a story that had gotten a remake, um, and the remake of it had made it much more spicy, I suppose. And it also, from Christine, when Christine read it, I mean, she was just like, this is horrific. This is horrific because it portrays women as objects. It portrays women as only, being there for sort of the sexual pleasure of men. And then it also portrays them in horrible ways because it shows them as being shrews and as being more, as being emotional and all of these sorts of things. And so she starts a campaign against this book, saying how dangerous it is. And part of this, sort of campaign of letters that she writes, she also starts writing another book that she calls the Book of the City of Ladies, in which she goes through history, pulling out stories of women who are nothing like the way they are portrayed in The Romance of the Rose.
Yeah.
And her whole purpose, in fact, one of my students who read my book for the first time, she was like, oh, there's, I see the shadows of Christine de Pizan in there, the building of the wall and, brick by brick, that sort of thing. And I was like, that's indeed Christine de Pizan, because instead of building patriarchy, Christine de Pizan is building the city of ladies. Right. And showing how important women have been throughout history, even though men have ignored them and tried to write them out, they are still there, and they need to be remembered. And that, really, Christine, her point was that ideas matter, and that in order to get people to treat women better, we have to get them to think about women better. And so, I mean, she's just really crucial to my whole thinking about this book. If you think, if you really, you can see the medieval behind a lot of this book, even though it was set, a lot of it is in the modern era, but I was clearly influenced by Christine de Pizan. And then, of course, the second woman that you mentioned there is Dorothy L. Sayers, who also has been a great influence on my life. And Dorothy L. Sayers is an early graduate, one of the first women to graduate from Oxford in the early 20th century. She is best known for her detective stories. And as well as her theology, great writer. She was, I always, she's the inkling that nobody includes. She hung out with C.S. Lewis and was there in Oxford with Tolkien, etc. And she was just as great of a writer as them. In fact, I might argue she's a better writer than a couple of them. But nonetheless, she's not as well known. And one of the things, too, that the people who do know her, it's kind of interesting, Dorothy L. Sayers, she's often been co-opted because she's a safe woman for more conservative crowds, because she doesn't get political. She's actually a little concerned about the suffrage movement and some of that going on in Britain at the time. And part of that is because there are connections with it, with the eugenics movement, which she's concerned about. And so she actually kind of stays away from that, and she doesn't want to be a part of it. She also doesn't get outwardly involved in ordination debates because she just doesn't really care that much about being involved with them. But we have this one exchange between her and C.S. Lewis in which he's writing to her, asking her to come out on his side to argue against women being ordained. And she just simply tells him, she says, no, I'm not going to do that. And the reason she says, look, if you got down to it, she said, I can kind of see your side, but I think that God, Jesus, yes, is male, but Jesus represents both men and women. And she's like, I'm just not going to argue. She says, I see no reason for women not to be ordained. Right. And so, and what's interesting is that C.S. Lewis actually backs off on this issue somewhat. If you follow him, and I can't help but think it has to do because of the influence of Dorothy L. Sayers on him.
100%.
Definitely.
I love it.
Yeah.
Hey, this has been such a great hour together. Beth, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Yeah, the book is The Making of Biblical Womanhood. There it is. And we'll have a link to it on our website for our listeners to check out at thevicarscrossing.com. And as always, we like to say to support your local booksellers too, and get in there and get them to get you a copy of Beth's book. So Beth, thank you so much for your time today and for your work and your witness as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
And thank you to Beth, to Dr. Barr, for her time today. And we certainly want to recommend her book to all of our listeners today. Please check it out. And this would be a great book study, I think, at any parish. And so really interesting stuff and informative and transformative as well as we enter into these discussions. So thank you to her. Guys, it's been another great episode. So thanks to you. Good to see everybody. And we'll look forward to getting together again next time here on the Vicar's Crossing. Thanks again to our sponsors, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Thank you to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. And thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's, and so long.
Kevin George, St. Aidan's Church, farewell.
My name is Ian. Toodaloo.
Au revoir from the Vicars. And Ian and Kevin, remember to always look both ways.
I pray you cross la street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicar's Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicar's Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!